On March 19, 2003, the United States led an invasion of Iraq. The stated goal was simple, and, to many, noble: to topple the brutal dictator Saddam Hussein. The list of monstrous things Saddam had done to his own people was long and well documented, and when the American government added allegations that he was hiding new chemical and biological weapons of mass destruction, it offered an easy justification for intervention. Saddam's regime, once thought to be formidable, fell within a month. But what came next was not peace. A stubborn and bloody insurgency soon erupted, dragging the United States into an occupation of the country that would last for another 8 long, brutal years. Throughout that invasion and occupation, the U.S. would rack up its own list of abuses, crimes, and massacres to rival Saddam's, a dark legacy that continues to haunt both the United States and Iraq to this day. It is a legacy of prisoners suffocated to death in secret interrogation rooms, of whole families murdered in their homes in acts of revenge, and of an entire generation of children left with horrific deformities, all at the hands of the American military. Like pretty much every American war of the modern era, the backbone of the Second Gulf War was bombing. But this wasn't the saturation bombing of World War II or Vietnam, where entire cities were flattened. This was supposed to be a new kind of war, a clean war. The UN military favored what it called precision strikes. Some 2/3 of all the munitions dropped by the U.S. during the war were laser-guided, a technology that the Pentagon believed would minimize collateral damage. They also conducted what they called collateral damage assessments on nearly every single airstrike, a precaution that was hardly the norm in previous bombing campaigns. And while it is true that statistically, civilian casualties were ultimately lower in Iraq than in wars like Vietnam, that number was still far, far from zero. A chief reason for this was a doctrine the U.S. called time-sensitive targeting, or emerging targets. What that meant was conducting an airstrike on extremely short notice. Whenever intelligence suggested the possible location of a high-value target, someone like Saddam Hussein himself, or one of his leading military officials. The idea was to strike before the target could get away. But the problem with moving that fast is that you don't have time to be sure. By the end of 2003, the U.S. had carried out over 50 of these special time-sensitive attacks. The number of high-value targets they had actually killed in those 50 attacks: 0. In most cases, they couldn't even establish whether the target had ever really been there at all. The very first act of aggression in the entire war was a perfect example of this. In the early hours of March 20th, the U.S. struck the Dur Alarm, a compound outside Baghdad where intelligence had suggested Saddam had a secret bunker. The intel was wrong. No evidence of Saddam or a bunker was ever found at the site, but 15 civilians were wounded in the attack, and one of them later died. This pattern would repeat itself over and over. On April 5th, the U.S. military received a tip that a notorious general, Ali Hassan al-Majid, better known by his horrifying nickname Chemical Ali, for his role in using chemical weapons on Kurdish civilians, was hiding in a building in downtown Basra. They struck the building with overwhelming force, but once again, the intel was wrong. Chemical Ali wasn't there. The force of the explosion, however, completely destroyed the building and several surrounding houses, killing 17 civilians, some as young as 5 years old. Probably the deadliest example of these attacks came on April 7th. U.S. intelligence intercepted some communications that suggested Saddam himself was in a house in the wealthy Al-Mansour district of Baghdad. It took just 45 minutes from the moment the U.S. got that information to the moment a 2,000-pound bomb hit the target. That was nowhere near enough time to do any real collateral damage assessment, especially for such a massive bomb in a crowded residential area. The bomb flattened multiple buildings and killed 18 civilians. It was later revealed that the strike was based on tracking phone signals, which could only narrow down a location to a 100-meter radius at best, a huge margin for error in a densely populated city. Determining the truth about these airstrikes became almost impossible, especially when the U.S. and Iraqi sources told completely different stories. Take the incident on May 19, 2004. Military reported that it had engaged a camp of insurgents near the village of Mukhradib in Anbar province. They said they conducted an airstrike on the alleged camp before ground troops moved in and engaged the residents in a firefight. But Iraqi sources on the ground claimed it was no insurgent camp at all. They insisted it was a wedding. The gunfire the Americans reported hearing, they said, was actually from the common Middle Eastern practice of firing weapons into the air in celebration at weddings. Video evidence allegedly taken at the site showed wedding guests dancing just hours before the attack. The U.S. military, to this day, maintains that the wedding story is false and that the Muqarrib attack was a legitimate military operation. But the horror from the sky wasn't just from bombs. America's bombing strategy was also criticized for the use of other, more insidious weapons. White phosphorus is a deadly incendiary chemical. When it makes contact with air, it burns at an incredibly high temperature, and it will continue to burn until it's completely gone. It can burn through skin, muscle, and even bone. Its use on human targets is considered a war crime by many nations, although it is not fully prohibited by international law. The U.S. insisted that it did not use white phosphorus on human targets in Iraq. However, it did admit to using it to dislodge enemy combatants from fortified positions. Soldiers often used white phosphorus shells alongside high-explosive artillery barrages in a terrifying combination they nicknamed shake and bake. But accusations from soldiers and civilians of being directly hit with the weapon were numerous. White phosphorus was just one of many potentially dangerous chemicals used by the U.S. that could leave a lasting, toxic impact on the environment and its inhabitants. And that impact was harrowing. Soon after the invasion began, doctors in Iraq started noticing something horrifying. Across the country, the rate of severe birth deformities and stillbirths was skyrocketing. Doctors began monitoring the phenomenon, which became known as the Children of Fallujah, though it was seen all across Iraq. The city of Fallujah, which saw some of the most intense fighting of the war, was the epicenter of this crisis. By 2009, doctors there estimated that for every 1,000 live births in Fallujah, a staggering 14 of them had deformities. To put that in perspective, that is a rate higher than that of Hiroshima and Nagasaki following the atomic bombs. In addition to the birth defects, doctors saw soaring rates of cancer in both children and adults in the same area. A 2010 study determined that rates of childhood cancer in Fallujah were 12 times higher after the arrival of U.S. forces. The cause is thought to be the toxic cocktail of chemicals left over from munitions and other military activity that polluted the environment. Studies of Iraqi populations in the hardest-hit areas noted dangerously high concentrations of heavy metals like mercury, lead, and arsenic in the soil, water, and even in people's bodies, substances known to cause severe health problems and prevent the healthy development of fetuses. The widespread use of depleted uranium rounds by U.S. forces left behind a radioactive legacy that was another obvious cause of the health issues. And then there were the burn pits. The U.S. military practice of dealing with trash in Iraq was to simply dump everything, plastics, electronics, medical waste, unexploded ordnance, into giant open pits and set them on fire. These pits could burn for months or even years at a time, constantly releasing harmful chemicals into the air, which were then absorbed into the environment. The scale of this toxic damage was so vast that it even affected American veterans. Soldiers who were exposed to the burn pits, depleted uranium munitions, and other substances demonstrated significant health issues after returning from the war. Thousands of veterans have since been diagnosed with Gulf War syndrome, which is now widely agreed to have been caused by exposure to the same harmful chemicals that have so terribly harmed the Iraqi people. The civilian deaths from bombing and pollution were, for the most part, officially categorized as unintentional. But there was plenty of intentional criminality by the U.S. military too, especially towards prisoners. For all their public denunciations of Saddam Hussein's cruelty, the U.S. had no qualms about reopening his most infamous prison, Abu Ghraib, in August 2003. It was supposed to house the most serious criminals of the Saddam regime and those who had the most valuable information that needed to be extracted by any means necessary. In the chilling words of Captain William Ponce, who worked at the prison, "The gloves are coming off regarding these detainees." The U.S. government essentially decided that the Geneva Convention the international law governing the treatment of prisoners of war did not apply to their prisoners in Iraq. Internal memos and training materials were circulated that instructed staff on legal justifications for why the Geneva Convention didn't apply, rather than teaching them how to act in accordance with it. This opened the door to a plethora of torture methods: electrocution, waterboarding, sleep deprivation, physical mutilation, and extreme sexual humiliation were all alleged to have been used. Even religion was weaponized. Mostly Muslim inmates were reportedly forced to eat pork and drink alcohol, and had their Qurans confiscated and desecrated by prison guards. One interrogator later said that as long as no prisoners came up dead, pretty much anything was permitted. A sergeant named Walters later came forward about his experience working at Abu Ghraib. He described how prisoners would be brought in on trucks, blindfolded, and stripped naked while guards screamed and shouted all around them. He said it was standard policy to order guards not to interact with the prisoners in any friendly way, to make sure they felt as isolated and terrified as possible. Torture was used as soon as possible after a prisoner arrived, while they were still scared, confused, and unfamiliar with their new environment. His testimony aligns perfectly with that of prison inmates like Amin Said al-Shaikh, who entered the prison in October 2003. He remembered being corralled into a cell and stripped naked while soldiers shouted at him, promising him torture and death if he did not comply. In another U.S. prison, an Iraqi general named Abed Hamed Mulwish went to inquire about the arrest of his sons by U.S. forces. Instead of getting answers, the Americans immediately arrested him too and tried to make him confess to commanding an insurgent group. The interrogators then staged a mock execution of one of his sons right in front of him, before wrapping Mulwish in a sleeping bag, tying him up with an electrical cord, and sitting on his chest until he suffocated to death. The interrogator responsible, a warrant officer named Louis Welschifer, was eventually put on trial for his death. His punishment was a $6,000 fine and 60 days of house arrest for negligent homicide. The U.S. military broke torture down to a science. Soldiers openly discussed with incredible precision the best methods to get prisoners to talk. One soldier recommended, quote, open-handed facial slaps from a distance of no more than about 2 feet, and backhanded blows to the midsection from a distance of about 18 inches. Behavioral science teams were secretly involved and are believed to have directed some of the torture specifically to study its effects on human psychology. They were particularly interested in sexual humiliation, where prisoners were stripped naked, mocked, forced to wear women's clothes, and paraded in front of female guards. Alongside military intelligence and military police, plainclothes CIA agents also worked out of Abu Ghraib. These agents were given privileged access to Iraqi prisoners with a no-questions-asked policy, and their interrogations were known to be especially brutal. After one such interrogation, prison staff entered the room after the CIA agent had left to find the prisoner, Manadel al-Jamadi, hanging dead in a shower from his handcuffed wrists, with blood gushing from his mouth. On top of all this, there was the Pentagon's Special Access Program, or SAP. This was a top-secret black ops group, drawn from members of various elite special forces, whose primary mission was to hunt down Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. They were believed to be operating out of Abu Ghraib in a secret facility called Camp Nama, near Baghdad. They were reportedly so violent and so far outside the rules that even the CIA refused to work with them. One anonymous member described their most harrowing tortures taking place in a location known as the Black Room. There, every second of a prisoner's life was made miserable. They were kept standing for days on end, with constant loud, disorienting noises blasted at them. Strobe lights flared constantly to deprive them of sleep, and they were frequently covered in cold water to keep their bodies in a constant state of shivering pain. When investigators later tried to look into the SAP's actions, they were told that the group's computers had experienced a miraculous computer error that had destroyed all of their files. The treatment of prisoners in Iraq, especially at Abu Ghraib, was so bad that by 2004, whistleblowers had stepped forward to tell the public what was happening. A massive scandal followed, and 11 low-ranking soldiers were eventually charged with various crimes. But allegations of prisoner abuse continued for the rest of the American presence in Iraq. And then there were the massacres. There were several examples of soldiers demonstrating intentional, murderous cruelty on Iraqi civilians. Several of these incidents grabbed global headlines and turned public opinion heavily against the war. Among the first was the Haditha massacre while on patrol near the village of Haditha on November 19. A U.S. Marine, Lance Corporal Miguel Terrazas, was killed by a roadside bomb. Shortly after, the other Marines in his squad reported that they had gotten into a firefight with insurgents in some local houses. They listed 8 insurgents dead from the firefight and 15 civilians, plus Terrazas, as casualties from the bomb. However, investigations soon contradicted this story. Locals insisted that there was no firefight. They claimed that the Marines had gone on a rampage after the explosion, and that they had been the ones to kill the civilians. According to the investigation, after the blast killed Terrazas, his fellow Marines had stopped a nearby taxi carrying 5 unarmed men and shot them all dead, apparently in revenge. The Marines then claimed they took fire from 3 nearby houses, although only 1 rifle was ever found in those houses, with no evidence that it had even been fired. They proceeded to clear the houses, first by throwing in grenades, and then by sweeping through with small arms, killing everyone they found inside. 24 civilians were killed. The story quickly reached the media, and an investigation was launched. Several Marines were court-martialed, but the charges were dropped before trial for all of them except the staff sergeant who led the operation. He was convicted of dereliction of duty, demoted, and had his pay cut, but he faced no further punishment. The senseless slaughter of dozens of civilians with almost no accountability led the Haditha massacre to be nicknamed the Iraqi My Life. A similar incident occurred in September 2007, this time involving the private military company, Blackwater. Several private security companies were hired to support the invasion in Iraq, and on September 16, 2007, Blackwater was tasked with escorting a U.S. State Department convoy through Baghdad. After arriving in Nisour Square, a car allegedly approached the convoy and ignored orders to stop. The Blackwater forces opened fire, but what happened next is a matter of who you believe. According to Blackwater, they engaged the car, which they believed to be a suicide bomber, and then immediately began taking fire from multiple directions, including from local Iraqi forces and the crowd. Blackwater returned fire and killed several targets before retreating. The Iraqi version of the story is very different. There was indeed a car that refused to stop, but the occupants were a mother and her young son, who seemed not to have heard the order. Blackwater opened fire with such force that the Iraqi police on the scene believed they were under attack, and so they returned fire. Recordings from the Blackwater radio channel suggest they genuinely believed they were under attack, but there is no evidence that anyone in the crowd was actually shooting at them. Amidst this chaos and confusion, Blackwater gunned down 17 civilians. The company's license to operate in Iraq was suspended, but charges against the men involved were dismissed. It wasn't until 2014 that 4 Blackwater employees were finally charged and jailed for their actions, before being controversially pardoned by President Trump in 2020, to the condemnation of Iraq, the UN, and the families of the victim. Haditha and Nisour Square were the largest massacres, but the case of the Mahmudiyah attack was arguably the most horrifying. In 2006, a 14-year-old girl named Abir Qasim Hamza al-Janabi lived in the village of Yusufiyah, a few miles west of al-Mahmudiyah, along with her parents and 3 siblings. Their house was only a few hundred meters from a U.S. checkpoint, manned by 6 soldiers from the 52nd Infantry Regiment. Far from feeling protected, Abir and her family were terrified of these soldiers, and for good reason. For several months, the soldiers had been behaving inappropriately towards Abir. They would stare at her, shout comments at her, and generally make her feel uncomfortable. In one instance, the soldiers conducted a random search of her house, where one of them started caressing the young girl's face. Abir's family was deeply concerned and were considering moving her to her uncle's house elsewhere in the village. Unfortunately, they would never get the chance. On the afternoon of March 12, after a morning spent drinking, playing card games, and boasting about killing Iraqis, 4 of the soldiers, led by a private named Stephen Green, made their way to Abir's house. Abir, her parents, and her younger sister were there. Her brothers were at school. The soldiers burst into the home and immediately assaulted the family, beating the mother so badly that they broke her arms. Green and another soldier then restrained the family, while the other two soldiers took a beer into the next room and did what rampaging soldiers often do to unprotected young girls. While Abir was being abused in the next room, Green shot both of her parents and her younger sister dead. He then rejoined his comrade with Abir, where he described his murder of her family as, quote, awesome, before abusing Abir himself, with the blood of her family still on his hands. When he was done, Green raised his rifle and shot Abir dead. The soldiers then set the house on fire to cover up the evidence of their crimes, and as they later described it, they went off to celebrate with chicken wings. The fire attracted the attention of the rest of the village, including Abir's uncle and her two brothers, who were returning from school. They managed to put out the blaze and discovered the family's remains before contacting the Iraqi authorities. U.S. authorities immediately blamed insurgents in the area for the attack, and a preliminary investigation reached the same conclusion. Privately, though, Green and his accomplices boasted about their crimes to their fellow soldiers. Green described how little he cared about killing Iraqis. Over here, he said, killing people is like squashing an ant. I mean, you kill somebody and it's like, all right, let's go get some pizza. Multiple soldiers heard about the crimes and failed to report it. It wasn't until June, when another soldier heard about what they had done, that someone finally reported the truth to their superior. Green, who had since been honorably discharged for mental health reasons, his three accomplices, and two other soldiers who had failed to report the crime, were soon arrested. Over the following months, all four of the soldiers directly involved were court-martialed, charged with rape and murder, and each was ultimately sentenced to between 90 and 110 years in prison, with the exception of Green, who received life in prison. It was a small consolation for the survivors of the family and the Iraqi people. Green's attitude of casual violence and the dehumanization of the enemy was a problem throughout U.S. forces in Iraq, just as it had been in Vietnam and other American wars. It's what enabled many of the crimes discussed here. At least 7,000 Iraqi civilians were killed during the initial invasion, but far more died in the years-long occupation that followed. Exact casualty figures for the entire Iraq War are still disputed, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to over 1 million, most of them civilian, and most of them caused, directly or indirectly, by the United States. Being the world's undisputed global superpower at the time, America was effectively immunized from any accountability that did not flow from outrage within its own borders. The military was also extremely reluctant to turn on its own. The excuses and cover-ups seen in Mahmudiyah, Haditha, and elsewhere were proof of this, with American authorities trying to dismiss anything that contradicted their own cherished image of themselves as a uniquely moral and noble military force. But time has brought to light the true cost of toppling Saddam and the false claims made to justify the initial invasion. Today, the majority of Americans believe the Iraq War was a mistake, a view shared by many of the veterans who fought in it. Still, it seems unlikely that the high-level officials who urged and directed the conflict, with its dubious justifications and controversial execution, will ever face any real consequences for what they did.